Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Public Library. We're delighted that you are here. I'm Bruce Farrar. I'm the Branch Services Administrator. For those of you who may be here for the first time, that means I'm in charge of all the parking lots in the library system except the one in this building. Just needed to clarify that. On behalf of Mayor Bill Purcell and the members of the Metropolitan Council, we welcome you to the library facility. On behalf of the Library Board of Trustees and our director, Donna Nicely, we welcome you to the library also. And of course, also welcoming you are our co-host, Vanderbilt University, who not only supplies us with all this wonderful things to think about, but also the good things to eat. So we are always appreciative of that. This goes on the firm educational premises that if you feed them, they will come. Now, as I understand, we're going to be talking about ethics and where that leads us, and sometimes the trouble that can get you into. And to give this the proper academic tone, I brought with me a little book which is compiled from college students' essay exams. And it talks about some of the dangers you can get into when you speak out on ethical things and philosophical topics. For example, one person wrote in his or her blue book that Socrates was accused of sophomorism and sentenced to die of hemorrhoids. I do hope you've all finished your lunch. This was not a Vanderbilt student. These were compiled from essays of college students in another state, I must say. I dare not continue along in this line of reasoning. I will now introduce the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations for Vanderbilt University, Betty Nixon.
Wow, what a crowd. This is great. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Vanderbilt University and Michael Schoenfeld, who is often here with you. I didn't actually hurt him, so he couldn't come. But as you'll see in a minute, I have special reason to be delighted to be doing this. My job is to welcome you, to thank our wonderful partners at the Nashville Public Library, and to introduce the brains of this operation, Professor David Wood. If David is the brains, Chandra Allison, Mary Pat Teague, Margie Naylor, and Norma Clippard on the Community, Neighborhood, and Government Relations staff are the hands. And so I would like to thank all of these folks. Just a moment of sort of personal privilege. Today's speaker, Charles Scott, who is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and the Director of the Center for Ethics at Vanderbilt, I have known since 1954. He was a student at SMU, having come from the big town of Wewoka, Oklahoma, and we had a brief conversation before, in the process of becoming an intellectual once he figured out what that was. And he was not only a great student at SMU, but he has, through all these years, spoken out on ethics. And one of the journeys that took him to is to run for president of the student body at SMU. And I will tell you that the market for intellectual men and speakers out on ethics at SMU at that particular time was not large. So he didn't win that particular contest, but he has certainly had a distinguished and wonderful career, and it is my pleasure, though, to introduce David Wood, who will tell you a little bit more about that career. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Betty, and thank you, Bruce, for setting the tone, which we'll try to work with. I'm especially delighted to welcome our speaker today. Charles Scott is an old friend of mine, and in many ways he's responsible for my being here today. As I have to say I've never dreamed I'd be able to have him on our program. As you know, Vanderbilt has aggressively taken advantage of the dire straits of other universities and colleges in these last few years. And with Charles, the opportunity arose not just to recruit him from Penn State, but to bring back one of Vanderbilt's prodigal sons. Charles had been at Vanderbilt for 28 years before his departure opened a space for me to be hired. And it was he who had invited me twice to talk at Vanderbilt beforehand and introduced me to both a wonderful university and a city with great promise. I never thought we'd actually end up in the same department. But hope is one of our best values, and I think in this case it did not betray me. It went the extra mile. Charles Scott's a Yale PhD, a distinguished professor, that's with a capital D, distinguished professor of philosophy at Vanderbilt, and as Betty mentioned, he's director of our new Vanderbilt Center for Ethics. In his previous life at Vanderbilt, he founded and was the first director of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities, which has been an extraordinary stimulus to humanities research and conversation at Vanderbilt ever since. And he was chair of our department for many years. Charles is a prolific author and scholar. In addition to over 100 papers, he's written or edited some 14 books on time, memory, boundaries, a bit of a while back, dreaming, and the other, some with intriguing titles like The Lives of Things, Ethics and Danger, and his forthcoming Living with Indifference. He's a man strongly influenced by Nietzsche, in many ways a Socratic figure. Charles has a unique and influential voice in the continental philosophical tradition. Serious, challenging, powerful, never politically correct. He's an ethical thinker in the deepest way, one who always stretches our sensibility, always refuses comforting formulations. We are indeed fortunate to have him here today with us. Please welcome Charles Scott.
My plan has been ruined. Too many dates have been mentioned. I had intended to say that I knew Betty Nixon when she was my babysitter, but that will not work. She quoted too many times and dates and places. I think that one of the primary principles of a great university is that the effort is always to replace whoever leaves by someone better. And I have no doubt that that was the case when David came after I left. It's a great privilege to return and be his colleague. It's also a great honor for me to be here with you. I have heard about this group, about what you have been able to bring about by your interests and attendance and support, long before I came back to Vanderbilt. And it's indeed a rare privilege for me to be able to be on an occasion like this, which I suspect is quite unique in this country. So I want to talk to you about, can our best values betray us? That's the question. And I'd like to divide that up quickly into two parts. One is on the unintended consequences of good values. And the key word there will be unintended consequences. And the second is an example of a situation that shows some of the dangers of good values. And I'll call that, just for tentative purposes, the value of democratic space. But first, the first thing I'd like to do is simply to remind what I imagine everybody here already knows, which is that good values can have unintended consequences. And I'll give you a couple examples. One mythological that everybody knows, but just so we can focus a little on the point, is King Midas, who had the golden touch. And you will recall that gift from Dionysus to him allowed everything that he touched to turn to gold. Let's assume that he had a kingdom that in its day and time and by its own standards was intended toward peace and justice, for the sake of this example. The issue, I think, is not whether gold is valuable or not. And I think King Midas saw accurately that gold was necessary for the maintenance and the advance of his kingdom. But the issue has to do with the ways in which he pursued or he was getting gold. As you know, everything he touched turned to gold, with the consequence that when he started to drink a liquid, it turned to gold. When he started to eat food, it turned to gold. And when his beloved daughter touched him, she turned into a golden statue. The point is that everything that King Midas touched, in the context of the genuine value of gold, everything that he touched died. A second example, which is much more modern and which comes from my conversations with my longtime friend and former colleague John Compton, who is here. I'll call the Compton principle. His father, author Holly Compton, played, as many of you know, a crucial role in the Manhattan Project in developing the atomic bomb. And after that process and after that extraordinary accomplishment, he gave, when he was chancellor or president at the University of Washington, St. Louis, he dedicated his life to the peaceful uses of atomic energy. And John told me long ago that he was raised in the remarkable optimism and hope that the peaceful uses of atomic energy, particularly with regard to energy of all kinds, was going to be a major, major contributor to human benefit all over the world with regard to food and shelter and energy. And when was it, John? In the early 70s, late 60s, he reports that he began to discover that some of the greatest possible disasters for modern contemporary society rested with the peaceful uses of atomic energy. It had to do with pollution. It had to do with the storage of highly, highly dangerous materials. It had to do with contamination. And atomic energy itself, which had been an enormous hope and a huge value for the sake of human benefit, had the unintended consequences of creating the conditions for major human disasters. So here we deal with just examples of a broad point. The consequences of excellent values can be destructive. We're talking about, this is transition to democratic space now, we're talking about the limits that our best values have. I want to bring together the idea of limits and the idea of best values. The limits that our best values have, and let's call it the treasure in earthen vessels principle. It's not only that we humans cannot know enough to foretell the consequences of the values that we carry out. The point is that the values themselves are limited. They develop out of particular circumstances, our best values. They reflect needs and capacities and histories, our best values. And they require, I think, like any other living thing, I think that our values require change and development in order to thrive. I'm suggesting, and you might want to test this out and see whether or not this makes sense to you or whether you agree. I'm suggesting that the very lives of our values in being carried out in our societies and in our cultures and in your and my individual lives, that values have a kind of life. They thrive, they decline, course, value, the word value comes from valence, which suggests a kind of force, a kind of direction, a kind of power. And that power, the power of values to effect and affect, wax and wane. They have greater and lesser strengths. And I suspect that if the best values we have are not alert and are not as sensitive, are not, if we are not, in carrying them out, alert and sensitive to the changing circumstances of our lives, those values will get stale. And not unlike Midas's touch, can create deathly situations rather than opportunities for enriched life. A good example of this, I think, is a recent discovery that has to do with the treatment of children with muscular dystrophy. A kind of treatment that actually looks like it's going to provide enormous relief and even partial cures to muscular dystrophy. The downside, people have also discovered that it has a steroidal effect that is not traceable and can be used illegally and without detection by athletes all over the world. Unintended circumstances that actually can create problems, decline, and in the worst situations of death. My guess is, too, that the best democratic values that we have and the best democratic societies depend on an educated populace. And without a certain degree of education in the populace, our democratic values themselves can transform into those of tyranny. Nothing, I think, in the area of where things really count. I think nothing can be taken for granted. And even the best can contribute and can move toward the worst. So the question I want to pose at this point is, how might we carry out our values so that their limits and our limits are recognized and affirmed as we carry out the values we carry out? How can we carry out those things by which we live and for which we would die? Hopefully, they mean that much to us. How can we carry them out in such a way that in addition to believing them fervently and carrying them out with conviction and commitment, we can also at the same time be alert to their limits and our limits? I'd like to address that question by elaborating what I want to call democratic space. By democratic space, and again, this is another kind of term, you see if it makes sense to you and see if it's something that you can connect with, either negatively or positively. I just mean the space of a democratic society in which people live and move and have their political, cultural, and social being. It's a particular kind of space, I think very different from a tyrannical space, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. It is a term, democratic space, a term for the space of values and their uncountable differences. A democratic space is going to be characterized by all manner of differences. It's a space of basic differences, a democratic space. Now, when my way of life, does not appreciate or affirm the intrinsic value of democratic space, I will very likely, if the way I carry out my own ethos, my own convictions, the kind of values that I and whoever forms my we live by, if I'm not sensitive to the value, the intrinsic value of democratic space when I carry those values out, and if I'm really convinced of the values that I hold, I very likely will want to in some way define or control or to eliminate those values you carry out that I think are fundamentally wrong and very different from the way I live. What I'm suggesting is that if I carry out the values that most matter to me in my commitment with no sensitivity to the very space in which they occur, which is the space of multiple differences. If I try to control those differences, and if I try to control you in your differences from my ethos, we're going to have trouble. And it's very likely going to be a highly destructive trouble, because I may well set out to either destroy by definition or by oppression the values that you live by that I think are fundamentally wrong. I suspect, then, that my effort to define democratic space by the values that mean most to me will end with the perhaps unintended consequence of destructive conflict. And such a destructive conflict in a democratic space in the long run will very likely undermine and undercut the most necessary condition for my own way of life, which is that space which allows it in its differences from all the other differences that inhabit that space. If I affirm, on the other hand, if I affirm the value of democratic space, I will want to find ways to live with those other ways of life that I fundamentally disagree with. I would like to call it, I would value an environment of basic living differences. And I will know, in that sensitivity to democratic space, I will know that a primary responsibility is to defend the rights of those values that differ from mine, as distinct to defining them by my values or oppressing them in the name of my values. The issue is how we carry it out, I think. I think the issue is the way in which we hold what defines our way of life at its best, the way we hold it, particularly in relation to the values of other ways of life. I'd like to close by telling you about a dream I had many years ago. I dreamt that I had caught a small bird in my house. And I found that bird both beautiful and, in a very strange sense, wonderful. That's just the way it felt. I held it in my hand, and it started to peck the skin between my index finger and my thumb. I took it to the window and let it go, with a deep sense of disappointment and loss, sadness. The bird flew out and away, and then turned and flew back and looked at me. And I realized the bird was something that I was not to hold. And when I didn't try to hold it, it returned and stayed free. I imagine that we probably have to let our best values go, release them in this sense. If we hold them too tightly, too dogmatically, or too rigidly, they will likely cause disaster, just like King Midas's touch. They need to grow and change in order to meet the differences that living always seems to bring, especially in a space defined by diversified differences. Our best values can betray us when we betray them by holding them too tightly and denying them their lives, which need to grow and transform. Thank you.
Well, as you probably know, at this point, I engage our speaker with a few questions, and then we open the discussion to the floor. And I'd like to start off, Charles, with that bird example.
I thought you might.
I'm reminded of, I mean, this is a beautiful dream. I'm reminded of a discussion of love by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And this is in a book called Being and Nothingness. And to make it really sort of straightforward, he says that, I mean, the more we love somebody, the more important that love becomes to us, the more we don't want to lose it. So the more we're tempted to try to control it. And in doing so, we may kill the very thing we love by holding it too tightly, as you're saying. Now, we could conclude from this sort of analysis or your example that our best values betray us, but we might come to a different conclusion. We might conclude that when we think of love in the way that Sartre is thinking about love, that isn't actually our best value. It's our sort of second best. And that a less possessive love, which we could sort of think through and sort of get to, you know, intellectually and maybe emotionally, a less possessive love would be one of our truly best values. In other words, I guess I'm wondering whether, when we talk about our best values betraying us, we haven't allowed those values to evolve enough to be the best versions of them. And in the case of democratic space, the parallel would be that, and I think you're sort of moving in this direction, that while tolerance seems like one of our best values, we need to remember that it cannot include tolerance for intolerance. So something like uncritical tolerance would be sort of second best. And then a critical form of tolerance would be the best. And that wouldn't betray us in the same way as this more uncritical tolerance. So I'm wondering, this is my first question, whether... And then I'll pause. So I'm wondering whether you're not pointing the way, actually, to a reflective improvement of how to think of our best values, rather than demonstrating that they have to betray us. You see what I'm thinking?
I think so. I'll work at it. I imagine that critical tolerance, as you described it, I like the term. I imagine that its weak underbelly is the degree to which, as you describe it, it is intellectual and reflective. That's not a bad thing, but it's a limited thing, and it's limiting. I'm not sure the extent to which a person has to think about tolerance in order to be tolerant or intolerant. I think it's an attitude, it's a sensibility. And if you don't have that sensibility, the way you think is likely not to be as critically tolerant as you would want it to be. There's something about fundamental values, and that's what I meant by best values, the ones that we want most to live by and identify with our own thriving. And those best values, your best values may be the ones that I think are absolutely wrong, and vice versa. Best means what a group of people understand their most fundamental principles for life to be. And we don't have an agreement on that universally at all. Now, how do you hold those basic values? I personally have a great deal of respect for reflection and intellection. But there has to be something else that I don't know the proper name for. Maybe some of you can help us out on this. I don't know what the proper name for this more fundamental sensibility that seems to control the way people think and the way people desire, both at the same time. A kind of basic commitment or committedness or insight that doesn't necessarily come from careful thought. Now, I don't know whether I have responded adequately to your point or not, and I'll be interested to know.
You know, one of the other titles that you could have used for your paper is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I suppose, again, I'm wondering whether you're not giving us a really good argument for, and your last sort of gesturing for a word or a concept, I think is really interesting. Whether you're not giving us a good argument for there being a really fundamental value that would not betray us, that we haven't quite articulated yet. I mean, this is, let me just give you a thought here. And you could call it, not holding our values too tightly. I mean, this is a gesture towards that. And holding them, but not holding them too tightly. And then I wonder whether you couldn't translate that into some kind of positive disposition, like wisdom, or practical wisdom, or patience, or, no, that's not positive, non-fanaticism, or even phronesis. In other words, I'm wondering if there aren't words out there that at least are in the ballpark of what you're talking about, that would give a positive spin to the negative formulation of not holding them too tightly. I mean, is there is something like practical wisdom just too floppy?
No, not too sloppy.
Is that going in the right direction?
It's awfully philosophical, which plays to my likes and dislikes. This is what I'm nervous about, David. I'm nervous over whether or not you are urging me, directing me, to make the value of not holding too tightly a normative value for everybody else's values. And if that's the case, we're looking again, you want this, if I were to do that on my terms, I suddenly would start wanting to control those of you out there that I think hold your values too tightly. I'm going to say, I want to get a law passed that says if you hold your values too tightly, you either get fined or you go to jail because you're going to cause bad trouble. I don't know what to do at this point other than say, yes, I think not holding values too tightly, but holding them with life and death commitment at the same time. That's the trick within the ethos that I live. And I suspect it ties up with a lot of other people who live broadly within a lineage of Judeo-Christian values. Not everybody, but a lot. On the other hand, I'm suspicious of the move as a disposition. You used a very nice phrase, a positive disposition. I like that phrase a lot. But I'm worried about the disposition that looks for a dominant best value. So friend to friend, that's just not one way to hell I'm going to go with you.
Well, this has never happened before. I guess I think that you're holding on to something really powerfully here, which you're promoting, which is your refusal to universalize, which I think you're kind of saying everyone should hold this view.
I'm going to give you the best argument that I know how to give, and that is, no, David, I am not.
So this is what we do back on campus. Okay, here's another formulation, another stab at a response here. And this is, I guess, an opportunity to sort of maybe expand a bit more on the connection between the danger of taking these individual values one-sidedly and this democratic space. And I'm wondering if there really isn't an important connection between these two things, between the danger of promoting particular values in a sort of dogmatic way and this whole idea of democratic space, and something you mentioned in passing, the vulnerability of that democratic space, especially in the absence of education. Because ideally, I mean, I'm trying to think about this connection here between the dangers you're talking about and the health of a democratic space. For ideally, a democratic space would promote the kinds of exchange of ideas and conversations that would smooth out the contradictions to which we'd be led by the unreflective promotion of our best values. I'm thinking, think about Midas. When Charles said, anything he drinks turns to gold and eats turns to gold, you think, well, of course, I hadn't thought of that, but if Midas had like a brainstorming session with his court, he might have had the designers install like a switch on his wrist so that he could, when he was touching things he wanted to turn to gold, he could switch it on, and then if he was trying to just have a drink, he could switch it off. And in other words, you could more intelligently, through exchange, come up with a better value than just everything I touch turns to gold. Now, if this is true, then at the personal level and at the political level, wouldn't our attention switch from the kind of contradictions built into these values to the forms of life and forms of public discussion in which these limits can be overcome, especially when they turn into public policy? In other words, we'd say, well, of course, you and me, we come up with these dogmatic formulations of our values, and that's kind of necessary. It's just the way we think. But when we enter into public discussion, these rigid formulations get modified, get improved, and public policies is improved and perfected. That's not a word you like, but at least improved by this process of exchange and deliberation. The question then would be, how can democracy be protected against manipulation by fanatics, such that these extreme positions don't simply end up as public policy? I'm just imagining, a world in which that might happen. And and I don't think it's just philosophers, but lots of people say, well, the answer to that is how to stop that happening is through education. It's whatever we mean by education. Then we have to say, well, what kind of education? And it's not just teaching people facts. I mean, I'm trying to sort of creep up on your position here again. It's not just giving them more information, nor is it teaching them values. And that's a lot of what we think we're supposed to be doing, teaching people values. And, as a director of our ethics center, this must be something that you reflect on. I mean, are we teaching our Vanderbilt students better values, right? Or are we teaching them certain kinds of dispositions, which are precisely the sorts of things that enable them to handle the values they have got in more sensitive and reflective ways? Am I getting back to...
It's a hard issue that I'm hearing you speak. Let me ask for your goodwill for a moment and toleration. What I want to point out to David is that the gift of the golden touch was given to Midas by Dionysus. Dionysus has no patience with switch on and off switches. Dionysus is a god of will and of madness and of creation and of contradiction. It's not by accident that myth, which is a powerful myth, has a lot of wisdom in it. And a lot of that wisdom is not too practical because it deals with unresolvable conflicts. Dionysus gives a gift that turns around, that flips around on Midas. Now, I'm saying, in effect, at one level of what I understood myself to try to communicate to you, that there's a Dionysian level in the life of our values. And you have to pay attention to that element. Now, where I understand I struggle to be, David, and I'm not sure this is fair to you, position, if it's not, I want to hear it. I do not believe that fundamental and basic issues are likely to find resolution in deliberation, dialogue, and exchange. But I do think it's possible, am I too optimistic here? I do think it's possible to recognize that inevitability and say, by golly, a difference is a difference sometimes, and when it gets down to the level of fundamental feeling, we are not going to persuade each other by rational dialogue. You try to reason with Dionysus, and he's going to do one or two things. He's either going to dance, or he's going to send his Maenads to come after you and cannibalize you. He is not a nice god, this Dionysus. But this is an element in human life, isn't it? This Dionysian element. And my question is David taking, he knows perfectly well what the question is he taking adequate account of the Dionysian when he talks about the resolution of fundamental values? I don't think he is. And I think it's a fair claim that he makes on me. Am I taking adequate account of the importance of dialogue in a democratic society? And I have not sufficiently emphasized the importance of that. I think he's right. But on the other hand, it's not a matter of resolution. I think it's a matter of accepting the non-resolvable as an aspect of the space in which we live. And that's a space of value. Now, in terms of teaching better values, you bet I want to teach better values. But what I'm after in the Ethics Center, in broad terms, is the development of what I'd call an ethical sensibility, which is the recognition of ethical conflict, ethical question, and ethical problem. And it's not the same as teaching values that I think if you hold them, you'll be able to persuade everybody else and we'll be one big happy family. I don't think we ever will be one big happy family, but I think that's the genius of democratic space. It does not foster one big happy family. It fosters a family of conflict that have learned, by golly, how to get along, but not try to resolve the conflicts.
Well, if I may just respond, I'm very pleased to notice that Charles was trying to persuade me to change my mind, which suggests his commitment to discussion and rational agreement.
I'm not optimistic on that score either.
Well, I'd much rather have that than having your Maenads sent to cannibalize me. I think actually, strangely enough, I don't want to end on a sort of sour note of agreement. But I have the sense that we do agree that that what a democratic space fosters is, well, first of all, I mean, a respect and tolerance for difference. But I guess I'm saying that has to involve, and this is, I think, something you wouldn't really be able to deny at the end of the day, institutions and public policies on which we agree. In other words, those are going to be equality before the law, due process, I mean, things like that, which are going to be agreed upon by people who otherwise agree to differ on the specific values that they hold. And I take it that's sort of unavoidable, or else there isn't a space. There has to be a shared space in which to disagree. So at some level, these discussions end up with agreement on how we're going to hold open the ring in which we act out our conflicts.
Yes, I do agree. I do agree with that.
I think we better stop in terms, because we've got a point that we won't come back to very easily. Now is a great time, though, to perhaps open the floor to. I'm not weaseling out of things. I just thought we ought to. Yeah. Okay. Open this to public discussion.
Yes, I wondered if the word we might be looking for is empathy, the ability to see from the other person's eyes and put our own preconceptions on the back burner until we understand from the other person's point of view.
Okay, now we're going to just collect these. Okay.
My understanding is that I'm going to hear quite a few questions
yes.
and then respond. Is that accurate?
That's right, yeah.
In this democratic space that includes Rush Limbaugh and Howard Stern, where we're living by and holding on to our best values, how can we nurture the evolution of our best values?
Did you get that, Charles?
Yes,
you
thank
got
you.
Rush Limbaugh to deal with. Okay. Yes. Any questions? There's a question over there.
You want to do this one here or that one
On the
over
right. Yes.
This is not so much a question as just a thought. I mean, a couple of the things you said. First of all, you said it would be important to be sensitive to another's or other positions. That doesn't necessarily mean agreement. You also mentioned that we will never know enough to know what the unintended consequences of our best values might be. And so it seems to me that this is always going to be an incredibly dynamic, I mean, it's a dynamic process that you're speaking of, so it can never be static. I mean, it's just an ongoing dynamic process. In addition, though, I would wonder if you would comment on the advances in neuroscience and the things we know about brain behavior these days in terms of an individual's capacity to hold many thoughts in their head at one time, and even an individual's experience in life may determine whether or not they will have the capacity to do that. So it's not now just education. You may be able to educate until the cows come home on some issues, but some people just, the biology isn't there.
Thank you.
We've been having quite a bit of information about ethics in general, but I would like some specific response to our current challenge, which I think is very immediate, and that has to do with the situation of treatment of prisoners and, in general, honesty in responding to what's going on in our world. I think we're in a very volatile situation, and we don't have much longer to discuss it.
So this is like torture and truth.
Yes.
Torture and what?
Truth in public space. Truth-telling. Yes. Are there any?
Hello.
Yes, I just wanted to say I appreciate. Hi, David. I just wanted to say that I appreciate, and you've given me some insight. Someone said something that puzzled me yesterday, and you've just cleared it up. They told me that I needed to get in touch with my inner Republican if I was going to continue to write controversial articles, and I think I understand now.
I think he's sitting alongside the inner child. Is that right? Yes. Yes, sir.
Dr. Scott, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for being here. Years ago, when I was a child, I took it upon myself to write an ethics legislation bill for the General Assembly in the state of Tennessee. And I was defeated badly, with a lot of help from a lot of friends who helped me get as far as it went, but when it all ended up, we were beat badly on our ethics legislation. That afternoon, I left the General Assembly after having been whooped up pretty good on, and went to my preacher, her daddy, by the way, to complain to him about it. He said, well, Charlie, said, I can help you with that. Said, just help your folks just to love one another. And you disputed that somewhat a while ago, and I just want to know your feeling about uncritical compassion or critical compassion or love in place of all the legislation we try to pass. Thank you.
Yes, a question over here. And that one next, yes. And then,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, well, what was mentioned earlier was a space for dialogue and a space for discussion. And it seems to me anymore that there's no longer an agreement to disagree. There's an agreement to disagree, and I'll vilify you. And so I'm wondering what, and it comes from the left and the right. I'm making a general statement here. And what I'm wondering is what can be done to foster, once again, an atmosphere of intelligent and discussion and discourse and disagreement without vilifying one another. Would be interested to hear what you say.
Did you get that?
Yes.
Okay. There's a lady with a red
Yes. You two guys a while ago agreed that you had to have some sort of underbelly for all this democratic playground out here in the form of an institution, okay? Some structure like that. Well, then now that we've got this satellite radio, how in the world can you have an underbelly with such a vast piece of stuff?
You're saying that satellite radio is undermining democracy?
Well, how are you going to protect your space, your democratic space, or your not democratic space? Like you say, there's such a thing as non-matter, not matter, non-matter. Well, what about non-intelligence or whatever you call it? Something that works or fits in with satellite radio. How can you have this space, this democratic space?
Okay. I think we may have almost got enough questions for you.
How long do you folks have?
No, I don't.
10 minutes.
If you run out, we can get more questions.
Let's begin, if I may, with empathy. Charlie's question about love, happy phrase, uncritical compassion. And I think I can connect this also perhaps with the issue of vilification of those with whom we disagree. How are we going to get into an atmosphere of greater acceptance and less vilification? My first question is, to whom are these questions addressed? I think, in terms of this group, this is my assumption. I imagine that all of us here are very positively disposed to empathy. We are ill-disposed to vilification of those with whom we most strongly disagree, and if we find ourselves vilifying folks, we're going to feel badly about it, except under the most extreme circumstances. And my guess is, too, that one of the reasons that you're at this program, and one of the reasons that David and I are here, is out of a positive predisposition to a kind of compassion for differences. So if the questions are directed to us, then we're going to probably say, by example, we could talk with each other, interact, go to programs like this, watch what we read, and most of us here are probably strongly inclined to inspect our own motives. I'm assuming that with all the warts and blemishes that we're a crowd that would like to be seen in our own eyes as empathetic and moral folks. The issue, which I can just tell you frankly from the start, I don't know how to address properly. The issue is when you come to loggerheads with people who absolutely disagree with us on that and do not want to understand empathetically and do not want to carry out a life of compassion for those who are not within some circle of fundamental belief that you and I don't share. Now, in that kind of situation, I don't know exactly what to do any better than anyone here could address it, I'm sure. One appeals to enlightened self-interest. One tries, I think, from a certain perspective, probably one that we all share, we might be positively disposed to hear the other's complaints as long as it's verbal. But we're dealing with a Dionysian factor that is pre-verbal. And when compassion comes up against an absolute refusal of compassion and an absolute refusal of empathy, and one resorts to violence quickly. We're in a different order of problem. And I know what it means to try to keep my own house in order, and I know what it means to talk with people who are of a fundamental frame of mind, predisposed to a kind of tolerance that David is talking about. But when it comes to the nonverbal, the cannibalization in a certain sense, that side of Dionysus, and I don't know. I do not know how to handle that kind of question. All I can say is, at this point, would you disagree, that the democratic space that will allow people short of destructive violence to live juxtaposed to each other, and that will allow people to pursue very, very different life trajectories and moral trajectories, and that will allow folks who are immoral from other perspectives to carry out their agenda, because that's their way of life. I know that that's a precious thing, and it has to be defended. But already I've given away 50% of my case, haven't I, in saying that. And I just have to plead ignorance at this point and wish I understood it more clearly. Words like diplomacy and various kinds of governmental actions, non-impositional actions, ways of maximizing non-threat, willingness to fight. I'm no pacifist, but a maximizing non-threat are kinds of things that come to mind. But this is where I think dialogue and discussion and high specialization on many fronts that vastly exceeds my ken comes to bear. I don't know. Intrinsic lack of ability is an important point. I think that there is such a thing as habitual behavior, which can be carried out by those of us who just don't have enough marbles to play in certain games. I certainly don't have enough to play in certain games. I think that the cultivation of practices, I think a kind of public value to something like democratic space, that's what I'm appealing for. That's the value I'm going for. That David immediately, of course, said, well, you're trying to impose this on all of us. Or if not impose, at least persuade me by good rational argument that this is something we ought to do. And there's truth to that. But I don't think it is reasonable and expectable that most of us will be able to hold the kinds of things in mind, the complexities in mind, that are engaged in a democratic space. I use the word uncountable differences at the beginning of my remarks, and I think that's probably beyond most people's grasp. So I don't think that our hope can rest with intellectual brain ability at all. But I think that it can rest with an appreciation for what I'm calling the space of difference, which is very, very different from the space of my ethos. That's the basic thing I wanted to push. And I reach my limit when we go outside democratic space in terms of what I was saying today. But I was arguing that those of us in this room and many others beside can radically hurt our own democratic space by the way in which we pursue what we think is most important for human lives. I think you were talking about the virtual world, that opposite of the underbelly, that vast virtual world, and we're in a new, we being everybody in the world, is facing a different kind of world. That's one of those kinds of developments in which a lot of basic values are going to have to come to terms with that. They're going to have to, the basic values are going to have to take account of that. It may be no smaller than the discovery that the world wasn't flat. I don't know, but I do think we're on the front end of something. There probably is still an underbelly, if that's of any comfort at this point. But yeah, the virtual world, which many people think to be a huge advantage for democratic interests and spirits, also is going to fundamentally alter the way in which our society works. And I have no idea. All of you are asking questions. I don't have any idea how to answer these questions. I like that phrase, my inner Republican. It could be just as damaging to refer to some people as inner Democrat. But yes, in a certain sense, it is a matter of getting in touch with a shadow side or with a side of oneself that isn't accepted, or with a Dionysian side. I think self-honesty has a lot to do with it. And it has to do sometimes in terms of what is not dominant in one's own character. I think we're at 1 o'clock, and I long since have passed the range in which I can speak intelligibly. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles.
My pleasure, John.